The plane was already in motion when Marcus stepped into the boarding bridge, but the real journey had started long before takeoff. He adjusted his jacket calmly, holding his phone in one hand and his boarding pass in the other, walking with a kind of quiet confidence that didn't ask for attention but somehow still received it. Around him, passengers moved with the usual airport rush, dragging suitcases, checking screens, and rushing toward their gates. But something about first class always slowed people down in a different way. It wasn't just travel, it was observation, and Marcus could feel that familiar weight of eyes before he even reached his seat. When he entered the cabin, the lighting was softer, the seats wider, the atmosphere quieter. A woman already seated in to be looked up as he approached, her expression shifting slightly the moment her eyes settled on him. It wasn't dramatic, not loud, but it was immediate enough for Marcus to notice. He stopped at his assigned seat, and for a second he just confirmed it again on the boarding pass. Not because he was unsure, but because he already knew what was coming next. He had seen it too many times, in too many places. Before he even sat down, the woman spoke. "Excuse me, I think you're in the wrong seat." Her tone was polite on the surface, but there was something underneath it that didn't match the words. It wasn't curiosity, it was certainty disguised as concern. A few passengers nearby slowed their movements slightly, pretending not to listen while clearly listening to everything. Marcus paused, one hand still resting lightly on the overhead compartment, then looked down at the seat number again. Then he looked back at her. His expression didn't change. There was no irritation, no surprise, just a calmness that had clearly been built over years of moments exactly like this. "No," he said quietly, "I'm not." The woman gave a small laugh, the kind people use when they already believe they are right and are just waiting for the other person to realize it. She leaned back slightly in her seat, crossing one leg over the other. "Yeah, I'm pretty sure you are," she said. "First-class seating is assigned properly. Maybe you should double-check your boarding pass." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He simply reached into his pocket, took out the boarding pass, and looked at it again slowly. Not because he needed confirmation, but because he understood the performance happening in front of him. He held it up just enough for her to see. "Tua," he repeated calmly. Her smile didn't disappear, but it tightened slightly, like it was being held in place rather than naturally there. "Right," she said again, "but sometimes they make mistakes." That sentence said more than anything else before it. It wasn't about the airline. It wasn't about the seat. It was about him. Marcus didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply placed his bag in the overhead compartment and sat down slowly, deliberately, like someone who had learned long ago that rushing changes nothing in moments like this. The woman beside him shifted slightly in her seat, her comfort clearly reduced now that reality wasn't matching her expectation. She looked toward the aisle briefly, as if expecting someone to step in and confirm her assumption. A flight attendant was nearby, continuing standard boarding procedures, but already she could sense something forming in the air. "I'm just not comfortable with this," the woman said louder now, directing her words toward the attendant instead of Marcus. That brought attention. A few heads turned more openly this time. The flight attendant approached with a professional smile, the kind trained to neutralize tension before it grows. "Is everything all right here?" she asked. The woman immediately responded, "I think there's been a mistake with seating. This gentleman might be in the wrong section." The attendant turned to Marcus and asked for his boarding pass. Marcus handed it over without hesitation. She scanned it quickly, then looked up. "Everything is correct, sir. He is in his assigned seat." There was a brief silence after that, the kind of silence where no one wants to acknowledge what just happened. The woman leaned back, her expression shifting into something less confident, but still not fully letting go. "I just don't understand how that's possible," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. Marcus leaned back in his seat, fastening his seatbelt calmly. "I'm sure you don't," he said in a low voice, not looking at her directly. The attendant moved on, continuing her work, but the atmosphere in that small section of the cabin had already changed. It was no longer casual, it was aware. People weren't just traveling anymore, they were observing. The woman beside Marcus stopped speaking, but her behavior changed in subtle ways. She adjusted her posture slightly away from him, occasionally glancing sideways when she thought he wasn't noticing. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to settle into himself. This wasn't unfamiliar. It wasn't even surprising. It was predictable. As boarding continued, passengers filled the remaining seats, overhead bins closed, and the cabin slowly transitioned from movement to stillness. The plane door shut with a final sound that marked the end of one phase and the beginning of another. Safety instructions began, but even those words felt distant now, like background noise over something more present happening inside the cabin. A few minutes later, as the aircraft prepared for departure, the same flight attendant returned, this time with a slightly more formal tone. "Sir," she said to Marcus, "would you mind stepping out with me for just a moment?" The woman beside him shifted slightly, a small expression of satisfaction passing across her face, as if this confirmed something she had already believed. Marcus opened his eyes slowly. For what reason? He asked calmly. Just a quick verification, the attendant replied. Marcus studied her face for a moment, then nodded once. All right. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, moving into the aisle. As he passed, he could feel the subtle shift in energy from the seat beside him. It wasn't spoken, but it was understood. He followed the attendant toward the front of the aircraft. Away from the seated passengers, away from the watching eyes, closer to the cockpit area where conversations became quieter and more controlled. What's this about? Marcus asked. The attendant lowered her voice slightly. We just need to verify something regarding your ticket. Someone raised a concern. Marcus exhaled slowly. Of course they did. There was no anger in his voice, just recognition. The attendant hesitated slightly, then checked the system again. Her expression changed almost instantly. Not dramatically, but enough to signal realization. She looked up at him again. Sir, are you Marcus Carter? He met her eyes. Yes. That single confirmation shifted everything. Her posture changed, her tone softened, and the urgency in her movements disappeared. Oh, she said quietly. She didn't need to say more. She understood now. I'll handle this, she added quickly. Marcus didn't respond. He simply watched her walk back toward first class, now moving with a different kind of intention. When she reached the seated passengers, she leaned slightly toward the woman beside him. Ma'am, she said calmly, there is no issue with the seating arrangement. Mr. Carter is in his assigned seat. The woman frowned immediately. I already told you, the attendant continued. And additionally, Mr. Carter is the individual who sponsored the first-class upgrade program for today's flight. Silence followed immediately. Not slow silence, but instant silence. The kind that removes sound completely. The woman's expression changed in real time. Confusion replacing certainty, then disbelief replacing confusion. That can't be right, she said softly. But it was. Marcus walked back toward his seat at a steady pace. No rush, no performance, just movement. And now, every eye that followed him carried a different meaning. What had moments ago been suspicion had shifted into recognition, and what had been certainty had turned into doubt. He sat down again and fastened his seatbelt. The woman beside him didn't speak, didn't move, didn't try to continue the conversation. The energy between them had completely changed. After a long silence, she finally spoke quietly. I didn't know. Marcus looked forward. I know, he replied. And that was the truth that lingered more than anything else. Because sometimes the most powerful shift doesn't come from what people say after they learn the truth, but from how quickly they forgot to ask before assuming it. The plane began to move down the runway, the engines building into a steady roar that filled the cabin. But inside first class, the noise felt secondary now, almost distant, like it belonged to another version of reality. The real tension had already passed, but its echo was still sitting between people, quiet and uncomfortable. Marcus remained still, his hands resting loosely on the armrests, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the window. The sky outside looked calm, almost indifferent, like it had nothing to do with what had just unfolded inside the cabin. That contrast always struck him in moments like this. The world kept moving the same way, no matter what people assumed, no matter what they got wrong, no matter who they underestimated. Beside him, the woman shifted slightly again, but this time not with confidence or disbelief. It was different now, smaller, more careful. She looked straight ahead, avoiding eye contact, as if trying to understand how the same moment she had been so sure about had completely turned against her understanding of it. The flight climbed into the air, and the seatbelt sign clicked off after a few minutes. A quiet wave of movement returned to the cabin as people adjusted their seats, reached for drinks, or settled into entertainment screens. But even as normal service resumed, nothing truly felt normal anymore. The flight attendant eventually returned with drinks, moving through the aisle with a professionalism that now carried a subtle awareness. When she reached Marcus, she paused briefly, offering a small nod before placing a glass of water in front of him. Thank you, Marcus said simply. She nodded again and moved on, but her expression carried something thoughtful, like the earlier events had stayed with her too. Across the aisle, the man who had spoken earlier leaned slightly forward again, unable to fully let the silence remain. So, you really funded the upgrades? He asked. Marcus turned his head slightly, acknowledging the question without urgency. Yes, he said. The man blinked, still processing it. That's actually impressive. Marcus didn't respond to that. Compliments never interested him in moments like this. They always came too late to matter in the way people thought they did. The man hesitated before speaking again. Why would you do something like that? Just randomly upgrade people like that? Marcus looked out of the window for a moment, watching the clouds shift slowly beneath them. It wasn't random, he said calmly. It was intentional. The man frowned slightly. What do you mean? Marcus paused before answering, choosing his words carefully but naturally. I wanted to see what people do when they think they're in a place of comfort, he said, and what they do when they think someone else doesn't belong there. The words settled into the space between them, not dramatic, not loud, just simple enough to land heavily. The man leaned back slowly, as if rethinking the entire interaction from earlier. So this was like a test. Marcus shook his head slightly. No, not a test, just observation. Another silence followed, more thoughtful this time. The kind that makes people reconsider what they just experienced instead of reacting to it. The woman beside Marcus finally spoke again, her voice quieter than before. I still feel bad about what I said, she admitted. Marcus didn't look at her immediately. I know, he said again, the same words as before, but now they carried a different weight. She turned slightly toward him. I didn't mean it like that. I just assumed. Marcus finally looked at her, not with judgment, but with understanding that wasn't soft, but honest. That's the problem, he said. People don't realize how fast assumptions turn into decisions, and how fast decisions turn into treatment. She lowered her eyes slightly, absorbing that. I've never thought about it like that, she said. Marcus turned his gaze forward again. Most people don't, until they have to. The cabin quieted again after that. Not awkwardly, but reflectively. Even the background sounds of the plane felt softer now, like they were no longer competing with anything emotional. A few rows ahead, someone laughed quietly at something on their screen, life continuing in small fragments, unaffected. But in this section of the plane, something had shifted permanently in perception, even if no one would admit it out loud. Marcus took a slow sip of water, then leaned back into his seat. The conversation around him faded naturally, not because it was forced to end, but because it had reached its limit for the moment. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly, the aircraft moving through it with steady purpose, and inside, people sat with their thoughts a little heavier than before, replaying moments they hadn't fully understood while they were happening. Because the truth was simple, even if uncomfortable. Most people don't recognize bias when it's happening. They recognize it when it's already been revealed.